Blog Talk Radio.
Live from the nation's capital, it's Quintessential Listening, Poetry, with host Dr. Michael Anthony Ingram.
Good evening. This is Michael Anthony Ingram welcoming you to the program tonight. My very special guest is Octavio Gonzalez. Octavio, are you with me?
I am. Hi. How are you, Michael?
Great. I'm quite well, and yourself?
I'm pretty good. Glad to be here.
All right. Great. Mm-hmm. Let me ask you a question as we begin this process. Mm-hmm. What is poetry?
What is poetry? Poetry is a cry in the dark, or a form of connection through sound and sense. At least those two things. So one would be the side of expression, right? The cry in the dark. It's in some ways the most fundamental of the arts, right? It's just basically a cry in the wilderness, if you will. Related to prayer and to chant. And then the other side of it would be the connection through sound and sense. So what gets communicated to the reader, to the audience. And so poetry in some ways happens at both ends of the process, right? The expression, the creation, and then the communication and the reception. So it's a pretty powerful form of projecting one's voice or attending to someone's voice. And it's many things, right?
Yeah, many things. I'm wondering, why do you think it's important?
Well, I mean, I think it's, like I said, it's perhaps the oldest of the arts, and I think, it goes back to the oral tradition, and it's really simply a form of storytelling originally. And I think, as Joan Didion says, we tell ourselves stories in order to live. And so I feel like poetry is in some ways the most fundamental form of storytelling, right? It's literally just a lyric voice speaking to itself and hopefully garnering an audience or a reader, but not necessarily. And so in a sense, it's a classic form of self-expression. And of course, the rhyme is a form of memory. And so if you combine the sound with the idea of capturing memory, it's a way that we remember who we were or who we are. And it's also a way of remembering where we were and where we are. And so it's in some ways a form of memory as well as it is a form of expression and communication. So
nice.
In that sense, it's a very human art form. It doesn't require any other instruments. And in fact, if you go back to its origin, it doesn't even require a pen or paper, right? It's simply something said.
Wow, very nicely stated. Would you share a piece of your work?
Sure. So I'm going to start with a new poem. It's a very long poem, so I'm only going to read the first page, but I think the first page kind of sets the tone, and it is self-contained. The title is Conversations with My Father, Fathers plural, and I started writing this poem November 5th, 2019. Conversations with My Fathers. He bought the blood to save my mother's life when they cut her ventrum in half, to splice me out of her womb a 9-pound infant who peed in my mother's mouth when she awoke and held me. His hair is all white now, soft as a unicorn's or a real steed not yet ready to become mythical. The Honeymooners, Bugs Bunny, even Alice's Restaurant. I watched them all, black and white and technicolor, in a powder blue bedroom, without windows, the TV screen my only window into worlds made of English, unaccented, generic, perfect, or quite the contrary. To the moon, Alice, Ralph Camden bellowed, his signature line, with the uppercut gesture, menace hidden in canned laughter. I don't want to write this, so I take off my glasses and squint in blurry vision. The sound of that and this, that or the other, what, the TV was on, my American babysitter. But I must stop crying now, must put back my $500 frames, progressive lenses for my middle-aged vision. A scar down her belly, ugly as cicatrix, the Latin more realistic, the Spanish too real, too cliched, too canned for now, that mars my mother's forehead. Though bangs would have hidden it, a perfect C, a third eye, her vision extrasensory, the last clairvoyante, I once called her. In this poem, too, her story takes some precedence, for she it was who told me all these fathers were better than one only. I count 3, no, 3.5, 3 3/4. How many men have I slept with? Do I count each one as a surrogate father? That, my friend, lover, sister, brother, is a step too far, a step beyond the precipice of this story. The end.
Beautiful. What are some of the predominant themes of your work?
Predominant theme?
Yes. What do you write about?
So I write about, so this is a poem that I started recently. It's autobiographical. And so I've been working on a memoir, which I call an ekphrastic memoir. And as you know, ekphrasis is writing based on a visual art. And so this memoir that I started is in prose form. And I published the first chapter, which is on this, it's on a Polaroid of me when I was about 8 years old. It's the oldest picture I have of myself. I don't have a lot of baby pictures. And this poem is in some ways a continuation of that memoir, except it's not ekphrastic and it's in poetry form. So a lot of what I write about is my personal experience and how it refracts through through my voice and my vision as a poet. And some of the work that I've been working on in terms of the poetry is a collection on love, which is in a very specific part of my life in my early to mid-20s. It was this passionate love affair. And so I've been working on a book of love poems. So this is not part of that, although I'm going to read some of the sonnets for that collection later on. So again, I write about my personal experience, and I've written, my first collection is on earlier parts of my life. When I was growing up in the Dominican Republic as a child, all the way through growing up in New York City and Brooklyn, when Brooklyn was still Brooklyn, a little rough around the edges. And so I draw a lot of inspiration from my own experience. Sometimes I have very vivid dreams that inspire me. And those, I'm not sure if those are experiences or if they're visions or a little bit of both. I'm also interested in plays, as you know, and so I've been working on this dramatic dialogue that I presented on this program a few months ago, as you know. And that one, part of it was inspired by a dream that I had. It was a very spooky dream. And so in some ways I'm haunted by certain ideas that become a form of writing, and I also am haunted by a lot of my own personal experience and giving it shape, giving it form, and also giving it memory by writing it and giving it some kind of closure. So that's mostly what I write about. I wouldn't say it is political writing, except, of course, because of all the intersections of who I am, it is by necessity political. And so that's a little bit of what I write about.
All right. You know, when you think about poetry, you think about, again, all the stuff that happens in the world. What is the role of a poet in modern day society, you think?
That's a very good question. So as you know, yeah, Shelley once said, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. And I think the poet's role in the modern world is as its conscience. And I think we need poets more than ever. We serve a certain function in the world. We remind people of our common humanity, as well as the importance of the individual experience and the individual voice, right? That voice in the wilderness that I mentioned. And so I think with all the political and social upheaval that we're experiencing, poetry can be a form of solace for a lot of us, and it can also be a form of agency and even political action, practice, right? And so I think it can inspire us. It can give us solace. It can also, give us hope. It can also work to dismantle the systems that, conspire to oppress us, right?
Yes,
and that's where Shelley was talking about being an unacknowledged legislator, right? If you are the conscience of your people or your community, then you will speak out against injustices committed to that community or by that community. And so I think it's a very urgent practice. On the other side of that, though, is that a lot of poetry is not accessible, and that's been the case for at least 100 years now, if not longer, where poetry became more of a fine art and less of a way of storytelling, like it was in the ancient days. And so I think that now there's been a movement. Slam poetry is the best example of it, where poetry is becoming accessible again, becoming like very political again. When I was starting out as a poet, American poetry wasn't very political, and I feel like that has changed in the last, say, 30 years, where like other nations that have a lot of political issues, American poets, I'm thinking, like Claudia Rankine, Citizen, works like that have really brought the politics of poetry to the forefront. And of course, slam poetry is by its very nature political, because it is about the presence of the poet and their voice, and it allows for voices that may not be welcome on the page,
yes,
and instead on the stage, right? And I think that's a wonderful thing, because it's broadening the audience for poetry and bringing it closer to what it was originally, which is a form of song and a form of mass entertainment as well as mass storytelling.
All right. Please share another piece of your work.
Okay, so I'm going to start, I wrote a crown of sonnets, which is going to be the heart of this collection of love poetry. And the first in the series, so a crown, just for those listening at home, Crown of Sonnets is a series of 7 sonnets. And it's called a crown because the first line of the first sonnet is the last line of the last sonnet. And so the first and last lines interlock in this kind of crown kind of figure, so to speak. So the first one is called The Wingless Hour. Scars on my back where my wings used to be. Sometimes I get goosebumps thinking of him, nourished with what I was consumed by. Smudged ring, yellow shit, warm marble tongue, licking a wet garden, musky with rosemary and thyme. Hello and goodbye, the boy man in matching parachute pants. Onion paper bags under his eyes, clammy hands, in a bed of seashells, empty with me in it. Strobe light throbbed in a hazy maze of my own fears. So I began to sing, warbled blue notes meant for him to hear, ringed lips smoking, what could tranquilize, restore. The end.
You've got to read another. You're leaving us panting and wanting more.
So the next is called the Eucharist. Lips smoking, what could tranquilize, restore, ghosting silent gestures, yellow lines, green ink folded over, opened as a Christmas gift, a new you with complicated hands, embracing my cold feet, which you swore to keep warm. Forever? What a story, my telenovela, red carpet star. Fountain of piss in a dim St. Mark's Place motel, drinking rum rain that stained the floor, but the taste, another word for love, was not candied sweet, was no Eucharist. My ex foretold the scene and perceived the rest, glared at the soles of his feet, summoning the beat to move on. Our tangle just began. The end.
All right. I want to hear all of it.
Okay. So the third one is called Magical Thinking.
All right.
Magical Thinking. Moving to the beat, our tango just began. My own private Idaho Bronco ride under Mormon white cotton sheets, which soon reddened and bloomed. Sprung loose like a baby's tooth. In Spanish, we say milky, twisting it back and forth, side to side, because it hurts so good. Because it's time, you say, but you didn't say. You come out swinging, lip-syncing, while I dance in a darkened hall, only to ride shotgun at dawn. Green sweat cooling your brow, bitter blaze of my coal, scuttle blonde eyes, charcoal tongue and bulging Adam's apple lodged in your throat. My lips blacken with loss, coals burning like fireflies. Cobalt Sonata. Blackening with loss, lips burn like fireflies. Mommy knocking feverishly on my bedroom door. Your friend is on the phone, she tries. She's crying. Nighttime shadow under cold, dark canopy of stars. Shivering indigo fingers. Black and white fingernails clutching hospital wool blankets. Ice, air, heady vein somersaults, drug-infused reverie. Giant navy brown boy towers over imaginary skyscrapers. My friend on the other side of the world, already gone. Cobalt blue windbreaker, strawberry-scented hair. I wobble from my childhood bed to unlock the door. Saved. Dark stars. I wobble from my childhood bed, saved by a sad teenage pact between best friends. Those were days of passionate self-hate. Yes, we drew sonnets in pencil and heartache. Unrequited hurts much less, but I digress. Resting my head on his skinny shoulder, my eyes shut against the midnight morning, sitting on the Brooklyn Heights promenade. He shrugged. I rose, only because she'd phoned hours since I'd planted my exquisite corpse beneath my permafrosted childhood dome. Christmas lights flickered on and off while I swallowed mouthfuls of dark stars, letting go the stream of bodily excuses. Bloodletting. Letting go, the stream of bodily excuses tells me that I need to go, like this dancing in my pants leading to piss in the toilet, but someone's already using it to vomit. Let's have some fun. Crown of thorns, the body follows meekly when it's spiked with juices. Tenderly, we rock and sway and swoon, motion hopefully akin to orbiting the moon. In my quiescence, no smooch or breach of confidence, only yeses and oh my's, the history of an evening's joys and this rolling Punch and Judy show, bloodletting only for sport, accidentally, proudly, after he's gone. And Baywatch Apollo. Accidentally, proudly, after he's gone, sweaty residue of sulphurous nights curdled into blind Sundays, 70s Beach Boy shag, bronze Monterey smile, dirty blonde mustache, amazing how the eye licks meat, confusing appetite for hunger. Was he herald only to the gaudy spring? I, corrugated sentinel, washed by Union Square skies, warding December games, playing hopscotch on rainbowed sidewalks, blind office mates under fluorescent light, hips locked after hours in the dark. Sun King, disassembled, son of man, shaving cream, scars on my back where my wings used to be. And that's it.
Do you sit and think through every word of every stanza, or do you write freely and allow the words to flow?
Well, for this piece, the set of pieces, it's a funny story actually. The first one I wrote in this series was Bloodletting, and I wrote it a long time ago. And I decided I wanted to write a crown, and so, with the crown you have all these set lines, and of course with sonnets we have all these set numbered syllables per line, and so it was quite an interesting kind of formal experiment to write in the sonnet form. I've never really done that, partly because I'm native Spanish speaker, and so the sonnet is a very different thing in Spanish than it is in English, and I don't really think in metrical terms. Most Romance languages don't. And so I kind of stayed away from the sonnet form, but of course this is a book about a doomed love affair, and so the sonnet has to make its appearance. And so yeah, there's so much going on, as you know, with a sonnet. You have to count the number of syllables, and if you are doing a rhyme, you have to, organize the rhyme. But of course, for this series, I didn't really follow all the rules. I only followed some. So most of the lines are 10 syllables long. I don't worry about the metrical pattern. As Ezra Pound famously said, to compose in the in the form of a musical phrase, not in the form of a metronome, right? To make it free verse. So these are free verse sonnets. But if you notice, there's a lot of assonance, there's a lot of rhyme. They're just not end rhymes necessarily. So playing with that ancient form to tell the story of a personal love affair. And in that case, you have to pour over every syllable of every line, right? Of course, every poem has to be 14 lines, and then you have to interlock the lines, right? The end of one sonnet is the beginning of the next. And so it was quite fun. It's almost like a jigsaw puzzle. With other poems, it's much freer, and I used to write a lot more freely. My earlier work is much more free. And that the new poem that I started is much more free and less controlled. And so I've experimented with different forms of approaching poetry, and I think part of the reason I turned to writing a play was because I was getting tired of my own my own lyric pattern, right? And so I wanted to sort of break out of that, ironically enough, break out of the straitjacket of the lyric voice. And in some ways, the sonnet is the most, as a mentor of mine, Rigoberto Gonzalez said, the sonnets are kind of like corsets, and I've ripped the bodice, for these sonnets because they don't look like sonnets. So I kind of go between extremely almost pointillistic approaches to my poetry, and extremely free, without even thinking about line breaks. So a lot of the poetry that I've written is in prose. So I go between those extremes.
Oh, wow. Fascinating. Let's take a brief break, and we'll be right back. All right, we are back. I am Michael Anthony Ingram. I am here with Octavio Gonzalez. Octavio, got a question for you.
Okay.
All right. All great writers, performers have great writing influences. Who are some of yours, and what makes them great in your eyes?
Wow, that's how much time do we have left? That's a great question.
We've got a couple of minutes.
Take
your time.
There's so many. I draw on a lot of older work. So, for example, for those sonnets, a lot of the sonnets include lines from Shakespearean sonnets that are that are transposed. And so I draw a lot of inspiration from classical poets, but also contemporary poets. So someone like Rigoberto actually is a wonderful poet as well as memoirist. He has a really beautiful kind of couplet form to his poetry. I've also grew up reading poets like Sylvia Plath and T.S. Eliot. So some of the modernists and the confessional poets were really influential to me. And to be honest, a lot of hip hop is actually really, and you can sort of hear the rhymes in my work. But like obviously they're off rhymes or slant rhymes, and I just love the rhythmic beauty of hip hop as a kind of a form of rhyming, and so that's been always very influential to me. I like to listen to a lot of that stuff, a lot of 90s hip hop, and I also do a lot of reading of novels and plays. So a lot of the modernists, we talked about Samuel Beckett earlier. So I kind of have a fairly promiscuous set of influences, everything from Shakespeare to, modernists like Beckett or Pound or Eliot to contemporary poets. So it's quite a grab bag, I guess.
Many poets have different methods for writing. Some write on paper and then transfer to another form of communication. What is your preferred writing method? What is your preferred writing method?
So it really does vary, but I do sometimes some of my best work has been written longhand, especially like if I wake up middle of the night, I just have my my notebook next to my bed, and I just start writing, and sometimes I don't even see I can't even see what I'm writing. I just keep writing, so it doesn't, so I don't lose it. And so a lot of my best pieces or my favorite pieces are those that started out on the page, and then I transfer them to the computer. And that really is still my favorite way of writing.
Mm-hmm.
There's something different about starting a poem on the keyboard, but it really varies. I feel like the ones that start on longhand are the ones that are the most urgent, the ones that,
Mm-hmm.
Almost like take possession of me and force me to, start writing then and there. And the ones that I start writing on a computer are more composed and usually more revisions as opposed to initial invention. So that might be changing though. I started the conversations one on the keyboard, so I might be becoming more of a digital native as I get older.
Oh, all right. So please share another piece of your work.
Okay. This one is called Begging for Quarters, and it is in memory of Sandra Rosado. Wearing sky blue button-down and dark blue jeans, 14, to go see Tim Burton's Batman. I felt so grown up, and you liked what you saw. You were taking me. A few days before you were begging for quarters on Flushing Avenue, you said, "Wow, you look great," and off we went. Tall Gothic skyscrapers with gargoyles and endless columns of concrete with eyes for windows. I was afraid, even as a young man, supposedly all grown up, the first time going to the movies alone, but going with you. In your nervous avoidance of eye contact, weeks later, sitting, vibrating, I did not understand why. You wore yellow. Your aunt and my mom talked while I searched for signs of you as your ponytailed, expressionless head turned away, and I was afraid it was something I said, didn't say, didn't understand, which it was. Pale yellow sweater, your skin even paler, yellower. You had told me once how things were, used to be, and, oh, Frankie, your husband, was as violent as the city of Gotham, scary as the scarecrow, rangy frame, yet strong enough to bounce you. I heard the knockdowns, the screaming. Endless sound. Chaos. This was nothing, you said, except you never talked about it. No. Instead, you talked about the lights going off, the bill not paid, in dead of winter, the ominous presence of not bats. So big, you said, they had eyes. I searched for yours, but they looked away as your skinny frame vibrated nervously while your aunt talked to my mom, who later told me what I didn't believe, as if heroin were a superhero, your secret identity. Yellow veins throbbing, your rigid posture of neglect. The screams were dark thunderclouds that ripped open the ceiling, so heavy did the rain of blows fall, and all I heard were your cries. I never saw you cry. Frankie wasn't Clark Kent. He was one of your addictions. I knew his skinny scarecrow frame, pale dark brow. This is not your story, Sandra Rosado. I gave some money to an AIDS charity in your name 15 years later. You did not die from being beaten by your husband. You did not die from being bitten by Brooklyn rats. You did not die from begging for quarters at the corner bodega. Remember how you asked if I wanted to beg with you? A child's simplicity looking everywhere on your face for a sign of the Sandra who took me to the movies for the first time. Surprised when I admitted the movie was scary. Coming out of the theater, Manhattan's gray shadows, skyscrapers were the towers of Gotham, the towers of Babylon. Sandra, you sat like a statue come to life, vibrating in yellow, clammy skin, eyes non-existent, wanting to escape this conversation. You did not die from sitting there. You did not die from your superhero serum. You did not die. Life killed you. The end.
Another powerful work. You know, all poets have several words that come up over and over and over again. Words or sentences that they just can't help but use in their work. What are three of
Yeah.
your absolute favorite words to use?
Well, apparently one of them is throbbing, which I've used at least in 2 poems that I've read tonight.
Okay.
When I was in high school, I believe blood was showing up in all my poetry. That was pointed out to me. I don't think I use blood as much now, though.
All right.
And I think cry has been showing up a lot too, and I think part of it is the sound I, which in Spanish is a sound of hurt or of pain. So in some ways, I like the sounds of words a lot, and that really guides my composition. One of my good friends, another poet, told me that I have a very acoustic imagination, to quote T.S. Eliot. And so I think with my auditory sense, where some poets think with their visual sense.
Yes.
So for me, poetry is about sound first and foremost.
You know, you are extremely impressive.
Oh, thanks.
Well, you are. You are. Do you think that you were meant
Thanks,
to be
Michael.
a poet? You're more than welcome. Do you think that you were meant to be a poet?
You know, I started writing poetry after starting writing fiction when I was in actually middle school, and I never thought of myself as a natural poet. I always thought of myself as kind of having to force the lines, and I think, I don't know if I still believe that, but I do believe that for some people, poetry comes effortlessly. A really great example actually is in Spanish literature, modern Spanish literature. So you have Lorca, who is this beautiful poet. The words just flow out of him. And then you have Unamuno, who's a very distinguished Spanish writer, but his poetry was very tortured, right? And I feel like, I don't think I've ever been I don't think I've been a Lorca, I've been a Unamuno. And in a sense, I've leaned into being a poet. But, you know, in the other sense, being a poet is not about craft. It's really more about sensibility. And so I think in that sense, I have the kind of the blues sensibility of a certain kind of poet. So that's how I would answer that question.
All right. As you think about your work, how has your idea of poetry, of what poetry is and what poetry can do, changed since you began writing in middle school?
Well, I think in some ways, for me, poetry began as a more direct way to express feeling, as opposed to, you know, with writing short stories or even writing a novel, where the storytelling is all about character and plot and atmosphere and mood. So for me, poetry really was a lyric expression, and I think it really evolved from that to become much more of a observation of the world. And as you can hear in that last poem, which talks about someone who died of AIDS, I think in many ways poetry is a form of witnessing, and I think that's a very different form of writing than, say, writing a story with a character in mind, right? And so, to me, it's a very immediate way of communicating emotion and also witnessing a certain person, a certain event, a certain feeling that is no longer there. In a sense, poetry is like a photograph in words, in ways that other forms of writing are not, because they have, whether it's characters or plot or other dialogue, etc. So, yeah, raw experience, as the saying goes, right? Recollected in tranquility, but sometimes, even recollection is not tranquil. So
it's true. Not only are you impressive, you're wise as well.
Well, I'm old enough, I guess, to be wise. I've learned a thing or two. Yeah.
Please share another piece of your work.
Okay. So this one is an early one, speaking of earlier work. I believe this one is from 1998, so way, way back. And it's called Preferably Breathing. Excuse my muffled tone as I hear endless voices peddling souls ready to wear to quick and easy takeout in 138 tongues. I am only one as I see things when they are at rest. Poems are also a marketing strategy for fools, but don't let this manner of preferably breathing carbon monoxide instead of air be mistaken for indecision. I can decide what to wear to a job interview as well. Obnoxious particles of me, myself, and I don't return any phone calls before closing time. I am not yet ready for my close-up. Are the size of your pores impeding your right to success? We can all sympathize with you, dear son of 1,000 days, taking tears for salt and water for wine. I have lived for 1,000 years, and sometime along the way I learned to pronounce my name. Let me distill your essence for you. It won't cost more than the bounced check, the forgotten dream of a 5 and dime. I can wash dishes when they're not mine, serving dog collar attitude with a smile. Or I can covet my brother's life, although I am not there to swallow the impure knowledge of not knowing who I am. Excuse me while I flicker on and off. The end.
Wow. Based on everything that you know about poetry, and you know a lot, what makes a poem good?
What makes a poem good?
I know
That's a great question because, there's this poem by Billy Collins where it's about the poem that he had forgotten, right? And so the whole poem is about the poem that he forgot. It's a wonderful kind of like self-conscious moment, right? I'm sure you have these phantom poems that you have in your mind, or maybe you have an idea of the poem and that poem is perfect, and maybe you can jot some of those words down, maybe you dream about it. And I feel like the perfect poem is always kind of already like a memory that never existed, and so every poem is an approximation of that perfect poem. Sometimes I have fantasies about what I could be writing, but I'm not writing right now, for example, because I'm too busy grading or something. But I do have these fantasies of like writing like effortlessly the really good stuff. But then you can just write, or I can just write whatever, and then a few years later, I happen upon this poem or that poem that I jotted down, and then it becomes this revelation. And so in a sense, the perfect poem is a poem that you rediscover you wrote, that you maybe forgot that you had written it. That's the case for that Begging for Quarters poem. I forgot I had written that, and I rediscovered it. So that's a long way of saying that it really depends on what the poem is supposed to be. And I think the perfect poem is the poem that most closely approximates that dream vision of its perfect form. I'm kind of invoking the Platonic forms in a very interesting way. But yeah, I don't know if you feel that way, Michael. If you have these poems that escape you and you're trying to like seize them as they run away from you, right?
Yes, I do. I'm in the process of finishing a book myself, and there are poems that I'm finding that I wrote years and years and years ago, and they escaped me. Yeah, I understand. I understand. Do you know what? We have a caller.
Oh, okay.
Someone would like to ask you a question.
Wonderful.
All right? All right. Area code 857, you're on the air. Hello?
Hi. I'm sorry. Hi, how are you? Dr.
How are you?
Gonzalez. I'm well.
Hi.
Thank you, and Michael Anthony, for this wonderful show. So I'm a social scientist, and so I'm very much grounded in logic and things making sense. And when you look at poetry, somewhat, in my mind, it doesn't make sense. But I also know that I teach, and I have students who I think would benefit from this type of examination of the world, I guess, rather than just having the cold, hard facts. I'm just wondering if there's any suggestions that you've come across to connect the world of, like, the social world with your poetry, and, like, what specifically possibly in some of the poetry that you have written, would actually help with that.
Okay. Well, what I'd like to do is potentially talk offline.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you for your question.
Yes.
Thank you.
Email me at maingram@gmx.com. All right? Well, here's a fascinating question, and we'll talk.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. We'll take a brief break, and we'll be right back.
Okay, thanks.
Back. I'm Michael Anthony Ingram. I'm here with Octavio Gonzalez. The call-in number is 646-787-1631. Now, Octavio, you're published, am I correct?
Yes.
Does knowing that your poems are published and out there in the world validate your being a poet, or are you content knowing that they're out of your system?
That's so funny. I've always been, I've always wanted to toot my own horn, and so even when I was in high school, I wanted to be published in the high school literary magazine. And so yes, I think part of the calling of being a poet is wanting to spread the word, and that's in some ways some of the frustration that a lot of us poets have, right? Because poetry is a fairly small audience, and so it's in some ways a self-imposed limit, right? Because we could be writing horror books or something and making, Stephen King kinds of money, or reaching Stephen King's, size of audiences. So it's in some ways it's a balancing act of wanting the poem to just come out into the world, and then wanting to share it with others, right? And I think a lot of people, myself included, sometimes write poems that don't really make sense to anybody else, and I think. So it depends, I guess, on the poems that we're talking about. So I've written a lot of poems that no one's ever, or maybe like one or two people have read, and a lot of them were kind of apprentice poems. So they don't need to be published, right? They were just kind of me honing my craft. But some of the other ones that feel more urgent, that seem more relevant, like the poem about my old friend who died of AIDS, that seems like it belongs in the world, partly because it is. In some ways, witnessing to her life, or the little of her life that I knew about when I was a kid. And so I think some poems are, really, meant to be for a broader audience, and others are just for the self, just to get it out on the page.
Wow. You've published a chapbook, and you're working on another?
I am, yes. So that one is called The Wingless Hour. That's the book of love poems that I mentioned.
If you had to share with a colleague or convince a friend to read your new book, what might you tell them?
Well, I would tell them that it's the core of that my new collection is a hopeless, doomed love affair that began in a clinical van on 8th Avenue in Chelsea, where I basically fell in love at first sight. And that love affair was in some ways doomed from the start, but it was incredibly passionate. And that's why I hearken back to Shakespeare's sonnets, which are also incredibly passionate and also incredibly tortured. And so that's what the sonnets are about. And I think in some ways it's paying close attention to a part of my life that I had in some ways buried, because it was one of those, very painful love affairs that you have in your 20s.
Yes.
But now, with the benefit of hindsight, I can actually write about that experience, and it's very high highs and very low lows. And in poetic form, it gives it a certain kind of beauty. And in that sense, I can, bring it to rest. But it's all true. So, the person about which those sonnets are written, he did become a telenovela star. He was on a red carpet. So it's I guess my poetry is basically factual, to go back to the caller's question about the factuality versus the truth of poetry. So if you like a good, juicy love affair, you will want to read some of this material, I guess.
All right. Share another piece of your work.
Okay. So I think I'm going to read part of my extracted memoir. The title of this is In the Photo, Part 1. And it's based on a Polaroid of me when I was on a holiday with my family, my mom, my sister, in Puerto Plata, which is a city in the Dominican Republic. In the photo, which is the sole remnant I have of my childhood, are my mom, my sister, 2 young women from the family I stayed with, and me. The photo shows everything about my family in one frozen moment. My mom, her face drawn into a tight rictus, squinting against the glare of the cloudy mountains at the Teleférico de Puerto Plata. She betrays no emotion save that of the warrior who is geared to do battle and expects even the wind and sun to be her enemies. She stands proudly, stiffly, her chilly air removed from the surrounding figures. My mother's hands are grasping each other, self-sufficient, while the rest of us remain to her side or slightly below, our bodies hovering in a different world. Eva squints in the white light of the foggy mountains, but note the sunglasses and the binoculars. She has the vision to see the vistas arrayed before us. She has the means to shadow those vistas, to protect her eyes from the glare of light. Controlling the sight and the sight, the eldest figure in the frame, perhaps the one who arranged the holiday to Puerto Plata to begin with, perhaps the one who made sure the Polaroid was made, the record kept. The cadmium yellow of her pleated skirt is the color of Caribbean sunlight, sunnier than the soft light in the frame. I like to think this yellow is her optimism, the reason for all the sacrifices she's made, is about to make, to bring us and herself to a better, brighter place. A place with streets paved in gold, as goes the cliché. Slightly below our mother's sentinel stance, my older sister Ismenia, whom we called La Morena, or brown-skinned girl, or Myosotis, poses with one arm in a hoop to her side, resting on her tiny waist, betraying the stiffness that elaborate feminine poses betray when portraying an effortless feminine posture. Squatting with her left hand on her waist, arm hoop extending beyond the body of our mother, Ismenia holds a blank, steady gaze with an intricately positioned body in meticulous Sunday dress and fashionable pumps. Myosotis, Latin name for the forget-me-not, wears a white dress with blue stripes and a pink sash. Her strikingly mature pose of the woman of fashion is belied by her occupying a lower height in the family frame. But below does not mean beneath. Her graceful limbs seem to patiently, carefully articulate. She pretends this is her scene, and it shows as pretense, but nonetheless striking, forceful for that. She must be 13 years old. The end.
You know, I've traveled to the Dominican Republic many times.
Oh, yeah? I didn't know that.
Yes.
Cool.
I could see it. I could see it.
Nice.
I could really, really see
Yeah.
it. Very powerful work. Very powerful work.
Thank you.
Share one more.
Okay.
We're almost closing. So share one.
Yeah, I'll just continue with this memoir.
Okay.
So I'm gonna keep this. It's gonna keep describing the photo. To the right of Eva, my mother, and to our left is Carolina, the younger sister, whom I don't really remember. And to her right is Ileana, her older sister, one of whose arms is carefully hidden behind her. I had forgotten their names, though I do recall that she, whom I call the younger sister, for all I know, she's actually the elder, flees from my memory, a mobile, normal girl, not prone to brooding like her sister. Ileana is my best friend in the photo. She is the person to whom I felt closest, both emotionally and, hence, physically in the photo. She hides her left arm because her left hand is shaped differently, what used to be called deformed. Ileana has stubs for fingers on that hand with a normal-sized thumb. She always hid this part of her body, and the photo's occasion is no different. Ileana's right arm, circling my shoulders, ends with her beautifully long fingers, extended as if to compensate for the other hand. Carolina's right arm, we notice, occupies the space where her sister's would have been. They are true sisters, by which I mean that the limb whose presence one sister wants to efface is replaced by the healthy, plump arm of the other. This surrogate sister, to whom I felt closest, has short hair. Her expression is a little bored. She is lithe and tall. Her charms are much greater than her hale and hearty, perhaps younger sister, although she feels the need to hide that token of imperfection which mars the beauty her body possesses. Finally, there is me. It is a curious pose. My hand holds the wrist of Ileana's arm, which rests on my small shoulders. I am leaning into her body. One would say that we are the most demonstrative of the 5 persons gathered for this family photograph. Our connection is physical, mystical. Ileana's smaller hand, which she always strove to hide in her long skirts, was a surprise to me when I first met her. Upon learning that I would come stay with her and Carolina and their mother, Doña Francia, away from my mother and sister, until such time as I would be granted a visa to leave Santo Domingo and reunite with them in Puerto Rico. For Dominicans like my mother at that time, Puerto Rico was the gateway to the promised land. I remember distinctly Ileana's rushed movement once my little eyes focused on her hand. What we now know is just a benign genetic deviation. She darted out of the room as soon as I betrayed my childish fascination with her hand. Yet in this photo, we are closer than anyone else is. Our physical bodies articulate that bond, based on the ineffable consanguinity that the wounded share, even if the wounds are in different places and the result of different wars. We too are survivors. It's funny how my little hand grasps her wrist, as if trying to hold on, as if she will pull it away in a flash. We could easily mistake the gesture as forced, as if the boy had pulled her arm around him, and he probably did. What we do know is that the boy is smiling. He is the only one. The rest bear serious expressions, the expressions of people who would rather be anywhere else, with anyone else, than to be here with each other. The sense of force permeates the image. Is it the mother's force that brings them all to this point in time, this point in space? Her tight mask seems to say so. The boy's face, however, radiates a weak smile, as if he had come in from the cold and found an entire family gathered around to welcome him and make him warm. Perhaps it is his family. I'll stop there.
Very nice. Do you know we've got another caller?
Oh, great.
Let's bring this person on, all right?
All right.
All right. Area code 617. The first three numbers are 458. You're on the air.
Hi, how are you guys?
Great. How are you?
Hi.
I have a question.
Good.
I'm good. I have a question for Tavi. When you
Yes.
talk
Okay.
about like earlier writing for you being freer, and then you were more controlled with the sonnets, but ripped the ribbons off the corset. I'm wondering what it's like now for you when you think a poem is done. Like, has that changed, or is that constant? How do you know you're done?
That's a perennial question. Even today, I was actually working on the first sonnet in that series because I wasn't satisfied with one half of the line. It's a good question. I guess it's the perennial answer is, a poem is never finished; it's only abandoned, just like a painting. But yeah, I think when is a poem done is when you're too busy with a new poem. So I guess it's kind of like, you kind of lose your. There's such a thing as revising too much or becoming too obsessive, right? And I think in some ways I'm trying to move away from that hyper-controlled kind of approach to poetry and be a little freer. And I think one way that I've done that is actually by going into prose. And prose is a lot less. It's more forgiving. And with prose, you don't have the luxury of being able to, worry over each word all the time. And so I think in some ways being freer and being able to put a poem to rest for me has meant writing other genres and also writing about similar material but in a different form. And that I think has shaken me out of the idea that a poem needs to be perfect or that it needs to be perfected. In some ways, a perfect poem is a dead poem, right? A poem that
That's awesome.
Has no life in it anymore. So maybe we don't want that. I don't know.
Right. Thank you for calling in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Tavi, we're almost at the finish line.
Yeah.
One last question for you. One last question.
Okay.
When people hear your work, they usually want more. I know I want more. I mean, again, it was great. What's next for you as a poet?
Well, I need to finish this book of love poems, which, I have a lot written. I just need to organize it, and that's next for me. I'm also working on that play that I mentioned that I read some of on this show last time, Q&A.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but I definitely want to work on this collection because I think it's almost done. I think I have all the pieces written. It's just a matter of collecting them and organizing them. So I'm very excited actually to do that. And again, the Crown of Sonnets will be the heart of the collection. So I'm already thinking about how to structure it. Maybe each sonnet will be the beginning of one section. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. And of course, I'm writing a lot of other things, but this is the work that I love to do. So,
I can tell.
Yeah. Thanks.
Well, I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight. It was a great hour, and I wish you nothing but the best. All right, great.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, good night, everybody. Until next week, enjoy yourself.
Bye-bye.
All right. Good night.